The morning mist clung to the cornfields in Galesburg, Michigan. On September 23, 1978, shrouding the rural landscape in a haze so thick it could have been plucked from the pages of a Norman Rockwell painting. The air was crisp, the kind that carried the promise of autumn's first bite, and in that small town, everything seemed untouched by time. But something was amiss, a feeling that would soon shatter the peace of this picturesque place. Just a few hours before the fog settled, deeper into the ground, Rebecca Hamilton's, 16 years old, with the quiet grace of someone older than her years, stepped out of Morrison's general store. Her cardigan buttoned up neatly, her hands carrying her schoolbooks. Rebecca seemed like any other small-town girl heading home from work, just as she had done every single day for the past 8 months. No one could have known, as she waved goodbye to Mr. Morrison, that this would be the last time anyone saw her alive. Galesburg was a town where everyone knew each other, where front doors were left unlocked, and neighbors shared the latest gossip over fences or cups of coffee. But, for all its charm, there was an undercurrent of something unspoken in the air on that September evening. As Rebecca set off down County Road 35, it was a walk she had taken countless times before. A walk that had always brought her home to the familiar embrace of her family's farm where her father, Thomas Hamilton, spent his days tending to his prize-winning Holstein cattle, and her mother, Margaret, devoted herself to teaching Sunday school at the White Steeple Methodist Church. The Hamiltons were as much a part of Galesburg as the red barn on their farm, a landmark visible from miles around, guiding travelers through the rural expanse. Rebecca had dreams of escaping the confines of small-town life, saving up every penny from her after-school job to buy a car and make her senior year something more than just the small, safe life her parents knew. But that evening, something would change. The thought that Rebecca would never return home that night that would unravel the very fabric of this tight-knit community, was as unimaginable as it was heartbreaking. A family, a community, a town that prided itself on its peacefulness, was about to confront a nightmare they could never have foreseen. So why did she never make it home? What happened on that walk, the walk she had taken so many times before, that would change everything? And most importantly, who was responsible for taking her? Would you like to uncover these questions, these mysteries that have haunted a small town for decades? If you do, like this video, subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and help us reach 5,000 likes to uncover the truth behind Rebecca Hamilton's disappearance. Now, let us dive deeper into her story. Rebecca's family was a cornerstone of Galesburg's heart. But it was not just the land that held them together. It was their reputation, their history, and the respect that everyone in town had for them. Her father was the embodiment of rural life, hard-working, steady, and proud of the cattle he raised. Her mother's warm smile and steady hand guided not only her children but the community, as she taught Sunday school every week. In fact, if you ever wanted to find Margaret Hamilton, all you had to do was look for the small white church at the center of town. That was her world, and her daughter, Rebecca, was a beloved figure in it, like a daughter to every neighbor, who watched her grow up from a child to a young woman. On the evening Rebecca disappeared, the routine at Morrison's general store had unfolded just as it had on countless other nights. She had stayed past closing to help Morrison, the storekeeper, reorganize the shelves. A task she did with the same care and diligence she applied to everything in her life. There was no indication that anything was out of the ordinary. The store, with its creaky wooden floors and brass bell above the door, had carried the steady rhythm of life in Galesburg, just as it always had. After saying her goodbyes, Rebecca stepped out into the cool, foggy evening, just as she had so many times before. As she made her way down County Road 35, the night seemed to close in around her. The gravel road that bordered the Hamilton farm was so familiar to Rebecca that she could navigate it with her eyes closed. Neighbors knew her well and would wave as she passed by, some from their kitchen windows, others from their porches. The Kowalski farm marked the halfway point, their yellow porch light shining like a beacon in the fog. From there, it was just a short walk to the small patch of woods that led to her family's farm. The final stretch would always be greeted by her loyal border collie, Chester, running to meet her as she neared the driveway, just as it had been every other night. But on this particular evening, as the mist thickened and the temperatures dropped, Rebecca never made it home. She never reached the comforting glow of her family's kitchen, never shared the warmth of her mother's famous pot roast, and never heard Chester's joyful bark as he sprinted toward her. Instead, the community would soon be thrown into confusion, fear, and disbelief as the truth of her disappearance began to settle like the fog that blanketed the land. The mystery of Rebecca Hamilton's disappearance would unfold in ways that no one could have anticipated. The questions "where did she go?" and "who was responsible for taking her?" would grow more urgent with every passing hour, and the peaceful town of Galesburg would be forever altered by the answers that followed. Would you like to uncover these questions? If you do, like this video, subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and make sure we hit 5,000 likes to continue this investigation. As the fog thickened and night descended on Galesburg, Michigan, an uneasy silence settled over the Hamilton farmhouse. Inside, Margaret Hamilton was busy preparing dinner, a task she had done 1,000 times before. The pot roast simmered in the Dutch oven, filling the kitchen with its comforting aroma. The table was set for three: Margaret, Thomas, and Rebecca. As it always was, Margaret hummed quietly to herself, a routine she had grown so accustomed to, a comfort on a Friday evening. But this time, there was something different. Rebecca had not yet come home. It was odd, because Rebecca was never late, especially not on a Friday, when the family gathered to plan for the week ahead. The minutes ticked by, and the deep chime of the grandfather clock in the hallway echoed with an unsettling urgency. 7 p.m., Margaret's humming had stopped. She stood still for a moment, listening for the sound of Rebecca's footsteps. The familiar click of the gravel crunching underfoot as she arrived home from Morrison's general store. But nothing came. The clock continued to tick, each second growing heavier. She looked to the door, then out the window, her eyes scanning the road. But all she saw was the thickening mist and the quiet darkness of the night. At 7:30, Thomas Hamilton, her husband, could no longer ignore the growing knot in his stomach. He paced back and forth, his boots leaving marks on the freshly cleaned linoleum floor, his gaze constantly shifting toward the window. Every car engine he heard in the distance made his heart race, only to be met with the crushing disappointment of not seeing Rebecca's familiar figure step out from the fog. His daughter was never late. But now, as the minutes stretched on, something was terribly wrong. The clock in the kitchen ticked relentlessly. As the time passed, the silence became more oppressive, and Chester, the family's loyal border collie, began to whine at the door. His instinctive restlessness mirrored the growing unease in the house. Thomas, now visibly distressed, could no longer sit idly by. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and headed out the door, his steps quick and deliberate as he began his search along County Road 35. The air outside was cold, and the fog seemed to swallow everything in its path. Thomas made his way down the familiar gravel road, his mind racing with thoughts of Rebecca's routine. Retracing every step she had taken, every turn she had made on her walk home. He passed the Kowalski farm, where their yellow porch light flickered faintly in the distance, but there was no sign of Rebecca. The road stretched on, but still nothing. He pulled his truck into the parking lot of Morrison's general store, hoping to find some clue, some reason why his daughter had not made it home. The store was closed for the night, but the lights from above illuminated the empty lot, a stark contrast to the warmth and life that usually filled the place. Thomas knocked on the door, urgency in his movements. When Morrison finally appeared, groggy and confused, he explained what he already knew. Rebecca had left the store at 6:15 p.m., just as she always did. There was nothing out of the ordinary. As Thomas listened to Morrison's calm, measured words, a sense of dread began to settle over him. His daughter, responsible and reliable, had vanished from a road she had walked every day for years. A chill ran down his spine. What could have happened in those final moments? Thomas's voice, now tight with panic, asked Morrison if anyone had seen anything unusual, anyone out of place. but Morrison had not seen anything. The storekeeper's account was consistent, leaving Thomas with only one terrifying realization: Rebecca was gone, and no one could explain why. The search soon expanded, as neighbors and concerned townspeople joined in, calling out for Rebecca in the growing fog. But no trace of her was found. It was as though she had simply vanished into the night. The once peaceful, tight-knit town was now gripped with an unfamiliar sense of fear and helplessness. As hours passed and the darkness deepened, the situation became more urgent. The Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Department was alerted, and soon, official search teams arrived. Law enforcement, along with volunteers, combed the countryside, walking up and down the road where Rebecca had last been seen. They checked the fields, the woods, and the ditches, any place where she could have wandered. But still, no sign of Rebecca. The search intensified over the next few days. Bloodhounds were brought in, their noses working tirelessly, but they too were left baffled. Helicopters hovered over the land, cutting through the thick fog, their searchlights scanning the earth below. The media quickly descended on the Hamilton farm, broadcasting the story of the missing girl across the state. The pressure on law enforcement mounted as the case gained widespread attention. But despite the efforts of everyone involved, the answers remained elusive. Detective Warren Fisher, a 34-year-old investigator who had recently been promoted, was assigned to the case. He had dealt with minor investigations in the past, small-town issues, like livestock theft and petty disputes, but nothing prepared him for a case like this. Fisher pored over the evidence, speaking with witnesses and combing through witness statements, but with every lead he followed, the case seemed to grow colder. The evidence was scant: Rebecca's schoolbooks found scattered along the road, and a single muddy footprint near the woods that had already been partially washed away by the rain. The books revealed nothing unusual, just Rebecca's careful handwriting in the margins, a reminder of the diligent, intelligent girl she was. Days turned into weeks, and still there were no answers. The search had turned up nothing. The community, once filled with hope and prayers for Rebecca's safe return, now struggled to comprehend what had happened to her. Detective Fisher, determined but frustrated, sat at his desk, the case file in front of him, growing thicker with each passing day. But despite his efforts, the pieces just would not come together. No one could understand how a girl who had walked that road countless times before could simply disappear without a trace. The once tight-knit community was now left to ask, was Rebecca taken by someone from within their own town? Or was there something more sinister at play? As the investigation unfolded, there was only one certainty: Rebecca Hamilton was gone. And the mystery of her disappearance was just beginning to unravel in ways no one could have predicted. How did Rebecca's disappearance leave the community grasping for answers? And what would it take for the truth to finally come to light? As the weeks turned into months, and the months stretched into years, the investigation into Rebecca Hamilton's disappearance began to stall. Detective Warren Fisher, despite his determination and countless hours spent chasing every lead, was no closer to finding answers. The trail had gone cold. There were no new clues, no new witnesses, and no fresh evidence to follow. The muddy footprint found near the woods had been washed away by the rain, leaving only the memory of what it might have once been. The scattered along County Road 35, a subtle reminder of the girl who had walked those roads without fear, had offered nothing new. Fisher had hoped that something would turn up, some piece of the puzzle that would make everything fall into place, but the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, without any breakthroughs. The Hamilton family, once filled with hope, now lived with a quiet desperation that seeped into every corner of their lives. Thomas Hamilton threw himself into the work on the farm, more determined than ever to keep the land running smoothly. The cattle still needed to be cared for, the fences still needed repair, but it was more than that. It was a way for Thomas to distract himself from the ache in his heart. The farm had always been his life, and now it was all he had left. The hours spent in the barn or working the fields seemed to bring him some peace, but it never lasted. Rebecca's absence was an ache that never went away. Margaret Hamilton, on the other hand, refused to let go. Rebecca's bedroom remained exactly as it had been the day she disappeared. The yellow bedspread still covered the bed, the ceramic horses lined the shelves, and Rebecca's homework sat untouched on the desk. A ghost of a life that had once been full of promise. Margaret kept everything in place, unable to part with any of it. It was as though preserving the room would preserve the hope that Rebecca would one day return, even though deep down, she knew that hope was growing slimmer with every passing day. Detective Fisher, now promoted to sergeant, continued to follow up on every tip, every lead, no matter how small. He drove down County Road 35 countless times, hoping to see something he had missed before. He interviewed people over and over again, hoping that someone, anyone, might remember something that could bring them closer to the truth. But the case remained unsolved, and the frustration began to mount. Each year that passed without answers only deepened the mystery, leaving Fisher with a sense of failure that weighed heavily on his shoulders. In Galesburg, Rebecca's disappearance had become part of the town's folklore, a story passed from one generation to the next. Every September, the Hamilton family held a small memorial for Rebecca, just outside their red barn, where the townspeople could come and pay their respects. Over the years, the number of people attending dwindled, but a few faithful souls returned each year, holding on to the hope that something would change, that Rebecca's story would not be forgotten. Though the investigation had stalled, the community's support for the Hamilton family never wavered. People would still offer condolences, and neighbors would still stop by the Hamilton farm to ask if there had been any news, even though everyone knew the answer. The small town had not forgotten. Rebecca, the memory of the sweet, quiet girl with the big dreams, lingered in the hearts of those who had known her. But as the years went by, the whispers of hope grew quieter. The community, though still supportive, began to move on. The truth was that no one really believed Rebecca would come back anymore. Life continued, as it always did. Farmers planted crops, families grew, and the seasons turned. But for the Hamiltons, time had stopped the moment Rebecca disappeared. Margaret, though she had aged, continued to maintain the missing person records. She would visit the local sheriff's department each year, sometimes several times a year, to remind them that Rebecca was still out there, still missing. She refused to let anyone forget her daughter, even when it seemed like the world had. But with every passing year, the weight of the unsolved mystery grew heavier, and Detective Fisher's frustration became palpable. Every unanswered question seemed to claw at him from the inside. What had happened to Rebecca? Who was responsible? And why had no one been able to uncover the truth? The case, it seemed, was destined to remain cold forever. But sometimes, the smallest of things can change the course of history. Could it be that the answers were closer than anyone had ever imagined? What if the truth had been buried for all these years, waiting for the right moment to surface? Would the case ever be solved, or was it too late? In March 2019, a breakthrough came when no one was expecting it. The land surrounding Galesburg, Michigan, which had been farmed and worked for generations, was now home to a construction project. Jake Morrison, a third-generation heavy equipment operator, was working on the site of what was to become a new housing development. He had spent most of his life on the land, so when the bulldozer's blade struck something solid beneath the earth, he thought it might just be an old fence post or some buried farm equipment. But as he climbed down to investigate, something about the object beneath the soil made him hesitate. What he found was no ordinary piece of machinery. The object appeared to be fabric, worn and weathered, but unmistakably manufactured. His gut told him it was something important, not just another piece of forgotten farm equipment. He had heard stories for years about Rebecca Hamilton, the girl who had disappeared without a trace from this very area. Those stories, whispers of the past, had been passed around town for decades. Was it possible that what he had found could be connected to her? Without a second thought, Jake reached for his phone and called the authorities. Detective Maria Santos, a seasoned investigator with years of experience in cold cases, was quickly dispatched to the scene. Santos, who had worked on several high-profile Investigations knew the significance of what Jake had found. When she arrived, she immediately recognized the potential importance of the discovery. The fabric was unmistakable cotton, or a cotton blended. It was clear that it had been preserved. By the specific soil composition and depth at which it had been buried, this was not just random debris. This was something more. Santos contacted the Michigan State Police Crime Scene Unit to properly excavate the site. Dr. Emily Chen, a forensic anthropologist from Western Michigan University, was called in to oversee the excavation. With her team of graduate students, Dr. Chen carefully sifted through the layers of soil, each one painstakingly photographed and analyzed. The process was slow, but as the hours passed, small bones began to emerge. They were fragile, worn by time, but still identifiable. Dr. Chen immediately recognized the bones as belonging to a young person, a likely teenager, based on their size and the incomplete fusion of growth plates. As the excavation continued, more bones were uncovered. But what struck Dr. Chen most was the deliberate way in which the body had been placed. It was not just a casual burial, but a careful one, as if the person who had done this had intended for the body to remain hidden. The remains were buried deep in the soil, protected from the elements and from animals. This was not a simple case of someone being disposed of in haste. This was a planned and intentional act. By the end of the second day of excavation, it was clear the remains were those of a young woman. There was no immediate identification, but everything pointed toward Rebecca Hamilton. The proximity to County Road 35, where she had been last seen, made the possibility all too real. The case, which had been cold for over 40 years, was now very much alive again. The identification process was meticulous. The Michigan State Police sent the remains to be examined by a forensic odontologist who compared dental records from Rebecca's childhood dentist. The match was conclusive. Rebecca Hamilton had been found after 41 years. The questions that had haunted the Hamilton family, the community of Galesburg, and law enforcement were finally beginning to be answered. But even with the remains confirmed, as Rebecca's, the mystery of what had happened to her, who was responsible, and why she had been buried so far from home remained unsolved. Detective Santos and her team now faced the daunting task of unraveling a case that had gone cold for so long, but with this new evidence, they finally had something to work with. The DNA analysis began almost immediately. It was a new tool that had not been available in 1978. Forensic technology had come a long way since the days of fingerprint powders and basic photography, and now, the DNA found on Rebecca's clothing and bones would be key to unlocking the truth. What secrets would the DNA hold? Would it lead to a killer who had been free for decades, living among the very people who had once trusted him? The community, though still shaken by the discovery, began to wonder, could the answers to Rebecca's disappearance, the questions that had gone unanswered for so long, finally be within reach? What hidden truths would the DNA reveal, and could this new technology finally bring justice to the Hamilton family? It had been over 40 years since Rebecca Hamilton disappeared without a trace. And for decades, her family, the town of Galesburg, and law enforcement had lived with the haunting question: what happened to Rebecca? But as the DNA analysis from the remains recovered in 2019 was processed, a breakthrough came that no one could have predicted. The DNA found on Rebecca's clothing was not just another piece of evidence. It was a key, a piece of the puzzle that would unlock the mystery of her disappearance once and for all. Forensic scientists worked diligently to extract and analyze the DNA, hoping it might match someone in the national database. But when the results came back, they were unexpected. The DNA did not match any criminal in the database. Instead, it matched to a genetic genealogy service, an emerging tool in modern criminal investigations. This technology, which used family tree connections to identify suspects, had already been instrumental in solving other cold cases. And now, it had led them to a name: Robert Sullivan. Sullivan was a well-known figure in Galesburg. He had spent decades as the town's volunteer fire chief, organizing charity drives and attending every town meeting and event. He was a pillar of the community, the kind of man everyone trusted, the one who was always there when help was needed. No one, not even his closest friends and family, would have ever imagined that Sullivan was connected to Rebecca's disappearance. But as Detective Maria Santos worked with genealogist Patricia Lombardi to trace the DNA back through family lines, they began to uncover something chilling. Sullivan was linked by blood to the genetic profile found beneath Rebecca's fingernails. Sullivan, whose reputation had been spotless for over 40 years, had been involved in the search for Rebecca when she first went missing. He had worked alongside the Hamilton family, organizing search parties, offering support, and even comforting Margaret during her darkest hours. The entire town had relied on him, believing that he was just as heartbroken as they were about Rebecca's disappearance. But the truth, as it often does, had been hidden behind a carefully constructed facade. The DNA, irrefutable and undeniable, proved that Robert Sullivan had not only been involved in the search, but had been Rebecca's killer all along. The arrest of Robert Sullivan stunned the entire community. The man who had spent decades earning their trust and respect, the man who had helped search for Rebecca, was the one who had taken her life. It was impossible for Galesburg to reconcile the image of Sullivan, the devoted fire chief and community leader, with the man who had brutally murdered a 16-year-old girl and buried her body on the very land he had known so well. The community, in disbelief, watched as the evidence mounted against him, piece by piece, leading to his arrest. But the arrest was only the beginning. As the investigation continued, a chilling pattern emerged. Sullivan's involvement in Rebecca's disappearance was not a spur-of-the-moment act. It was premeditated. The more they dug into his past, the more they realized that his public persona had been a carefully crafted cover for his darker urges. Sullivan had stalked Rebecca for months, appearing at local events and even visiting Morrison's general store when she worked, just to keep tabs on her. His movements, once seen as nothing more than the actions of a concerned community member, now appeared as signs of a predator who had been carefully planning his crime. Sullivan's confession came after hours of questioning. He spoke in a detached, almost clinical manner, recounting every detail of the crime with a chilling lack of emotion. He admitted to following Rebecca that September evening, offering her a ride, then overpowering her. The assault and murder were methodical, each action part of a plan he had carefully laid out in his mind for months. And as he spoke, he revealed details that only the killer could have known: the location where Rebecca had been found, the clothes she had been wearing, and the way he had disposed of her body. His words, cold and precise, sent shivers down the spines of everyone in the room. There was no remorse, no sign of guilt, just a man recounting his actions as if they were no more significant than a business transaction. As Sullivan's confession unfolded, the true horror of his actions became clear. The investigation revealed that his role in the search for Rebecca and his participation in memorial services had been a cover, a way for him to stay close to the family and the community while hiding his dark secret. He had manipulated everyone around him, using his reputation as a trusted leader to shield himself from suspicion. The town had never questioned him, never thought twice about the man who had spent years comforting a grieving family, unaware that he was the one who had caused their pain. The news of Sullivan's arrest and his confession hit the town of Galesburg like a bombshell. The community, who had once seen him as a hero, was now forced to confront the reality that the very person they had trusted the most had been capable of such monstrous acts. The shock was felt in every corner of the town, from the church pews to the firehouse to the local diner, where Sullivan had once held court, offering wisdom and advice to those who sought it. How could they have been so blind? How had they been fooled for so long by a man who had been hiding in plain sight? The Hamilton family, though devastated by the truth, finally found some measure of closure. After 41 years of uncertainty and unanswered questions, they knew what had happened to Rebecca. But the pain of knowing that someone they had trusted had taken her life would never truly go away. What motivated Sullivan to carry out such a heinous crime? And how had he managed to keep his dark secret hidden for so long? The answers to these questions were about to be revealed, but the truth was far more disturbing than anyone could have ever imagined. In November 2019, after decades of unanswered questions, the courtroom in Kalamazoo was filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief as the man who had been the center of the mystery, the man who had fooled an entire community, finally stood trial. Robert Sullivan, once a respected figure in Galesburg, now faced the consequences of his actions. With the irrefutable DNA evidence and his chilling confession, there was no longer any doubt about his guilt. Sullivan, a man who had spent years hiding behind a mask of community service and benevolence, had no choice but to plead guilty to the murder of Rebecca Hamilton. As the trial unfolded, the air in the courtroom was thick with emotion. The victim's family, the community, and the investigators all gathered to witness the final chapter of a story that had haunted them for over 4 decades. Margaret Hamilton, Rebecca's mother, took the stand. She had spent 41 years holding on to hope, refusing to believe that her daughter's disappearance was anything but a tragic accident. But now, standing before the man who had deceived her for all these years, she found the strength to confront him. Her voice trembled as she delivered an emotional statement. Speaking directly to Sullivan, she described the pain of losing Rebecca, the years spent wondering what had happened, and the heartbreak of learning that the very man who had helped search for her daughter had been the one responsible for her death. Margaret's words were powerful, filled with the raw emotion of a mother who had never given up on finding her child. As she looked at Sullivan, she finally had the chance to express the agony of being deceived by someone she had once trusted like a member of her own family, Detective, who had worked tirelessly to bring the case to its resolution. Also spoke, she reflected on how far forensic science had come since Rebecca's disappearance in 1978, the advancements in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, which had led to Sullivan's arrest, were technologies that had not even existed when the investigation first began. Santos credited these advancements for allowing the case to be solved after so many years, offering hope to other families who were still waiting for justice. When the judge handed down the sentence, it was clear that Sullivan's years of manipulation and deceit had caught up with him. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time in over 4 decades, the Hamilton family had an answer, a sense of justice, and the knowledge that Rebecca's killer would never walk free again. But while the verdict brought legal closure, the emotional scars left behind by the years of uncertainty would never fully heal, as the community of Galesburg began to process the shocking betrayal. There was a collective sense of disbelief. How had they been so blind? The man who had organized search parties, comforted grieving parents, and attended memorial services had been hiding in plain sight. The revelation of his true nature left a deep wound in the town, one that would take time to heal. The townspeople could no longer look at Sullivan in the same way. The hero they had known for so long was now a convicted murderer, and the community struggled to reconcile the man they had trusted with the monster he had been all along. For the Hamilton family, the trial marked the end of a long and painful journey. They had finally found closure, but the road to healing would not be easy. Margaret, though relieved to know the truth, still carried the weight of those 41 years. The loss of her daughter would never be something she could move on from. But at least she now had the answers she had longed for. The sense of injustice had been replaced by a bittersweet victory that came at a heavy cost. The case of Rebecca Hamilton's disappearance and the eventual conviction of Robert Sullivan became a landmark in the world of cold case investigations. Detective Santos, along with others involved in the case, became advocates for the use of genetic genealogy in solving crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. The case showed the world that, even after so many years, justice could still be served. It gave hope to families across the country who had lost loved ones under similar circumstances, encouraging them to never give up. Margaret Hamilton, now in her late 70s, continued to fight for other families of missing persons. She became a voice for those still waiting for answers, tirelessly advocating for the use of modern technology in solving cold cases. Despite her own grief, Margaret knew That keeping hope alive was the only way to honor Rebecca's memory. She often said that, though the pain would never go away, she would continue to fight for others so that they would not have to endure the same uncertainty she had. Rebecca's case, and the eventual conviction of Sullivan, would go down in history. As a pivotal moment in criminal justice, it showed the power of modern science and the resilience of a mother who refused to give up. But it also reminded us all of the dangers that can lurk behind the most trusted faces, and how even the darkest secrets can eventually come to light as the years passed. The case became part of the fabric of Galesburg's history. The memory of Rebecca Hamilton, the sweet young girl who had once walked the same roads as her neighbors, would never fade. Her story, and the justice that was finally served, would live on as a lesson to never stop searching for the truth. No matter how long it takes, who else might be hiding behind a trusted mask, and what secrets are waiting to be uncovered? The story of Rebecca Hamilton is a story of hope, loss, betrayal, and, ultimately, justice, a tale that unfolded over 4 decades, driven by the relentless pursuit of truth. For 41 years, the small town of Galesburg carried with it the shadow of Rebecca's disappearance, a mystery that no one seemed able to solve. Yet, it was technology advancements in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy that finally brought an answer. A breakthrough that no one could have imagined when Rebecca had first vanished into the night. This case serves as a powerful reminder of how far forensic science has come. In 1978, investigators had no tools to track down a killer like Robert Sullivan. No DNA database, no genealogical tracking methods. They could only rely on basic tools, intuition, and the hope that time might reveal something. And for over 4 decades, they were left with more questions than answers. But in 2019, everything changed. The DNA that was left behind on Rebecca's clothing, something that would have been ignored or deemed useless in the past, became the key to unlocking the truth. Genetic genealogy connected a killer who had lived free for 41 years to the crime, and the rest of the puzzle fell into place. Detective Maria Santos, whose work was instrumental in bringing Sullivan to justice, said it best when she reflected on how this case had come full circle. DNA technology, once just a distant dream, had transformed cold case investigations, turning what seemed like impossible cases into solvable ones. It was a tool that, once harnessed, brought families like the Hamiltons answers they had once thought were forever out of reach. The advancements in science gave them what they needed, most closure. But more importantly, it gave them the truth. Rebecca Hamilton's case is not just an isolated incident. It is an example of what can happen when persistence meets innovation. It took years, decades even, but the unrelenting hope and dedication of Rebecca's family, law enforcement, and the community never wavered. Despite the pain of not knowing what happened, the Hamiltons held on to hope for as long as they could. Margaret Hamilton's refusal to give up, even when everyone else seemed to have moved on, proved that a mother's love could carry her through the darkest days, and in the end, her persistence was rewarded. But as the Hamiltons finally found some peace, the broader lesson is not just about closure, it's about the importance of remembering the victims and the families who endure long, painful waits for justice. For every case like Rebecca's, there are countless others where families are still searching for answers, still waiting for the day when they can finally get the truth. Their stories are often forgotten, their pain unacknowledged, but they deserve to be heard. They deserve justice. The story of Rebecca Hamilton will continue to resonate with those who hear it. It is a story of resilience, of technology's power to solve the impossible, and of the incredible strength of families who never give up, no matter how long it takes. The justice that Rebecca's family finally received was hard-won, but it is a victory for all families who are still waiting for their day in court. As the final chapter of this case closes, we are reminded of the importance of never giving up. Never stop searching for the truth, even when it feels impossible. Because, as we saw in this story, sometimes the truth is just waiting to be uncovered. No matter how long it takes, if you are still watching this story, it means this story deserves your like and subscribe. Please complete 5,000 likes on this story, as this is a target set by my mother for you, so help me out. Guys, it is totally free. And before we finish, let me know from which city you are watching this story. Your support means the world.